Hi, my name is Mike Sherry. I'm recording a presentation on the Ogallala Aquifer, the Adaptive Management Plan, Actions and Strategies. It's for Environmental Management course EVSP 501 at American Public University. Today's date is November 10th, 2019. Today we're going to talk about some actions and strategies moving forward, things that we need to get done. Just to reiterate, we'll go back to the vision statement, and the vision of the plan is sustainable use of the Ogallala Aquifer to ensure the health and prosperity of future generations. The goal here is to establish methods and goals and a plan basically to allow for the regeneration of the aquifer to sustainable levels. So the first thing we need to do is we need to gather data. We're going to need to gather lots of data in order to be able to model particular strategies to help us to kind of determine the current usage, what the current needed restrictions would be or reductions in usage would be in order to help maintain those levels and the usages. So with regards to the aquifer, we want to establish a baseline. What are the current levels of the aquifer? Where is the level at? How fast is it being used? What sectors are using it? How much does each sector use? And then the rate of replenishment. What's the normal rate of replenishment? What happens during wet years and things like that? How do we know how fast or how quickly our reductions will replenish the aquifer? Once we have the data that kind of allows us to establish baselines, we're going to go in to do some modeling. Modeling will basically allow us to say, okay, at the current usage, we're drawing down at X amount based on usage, which we know through monitoring of wells and monitoring of pumping by various industries. So once we understand that, we can establish some models to take a look at what will the reductions be based on these models. We can add also, we want to adjust our goals of reductions based on precipitation and some natural weather and natural phenomenon that's occurring. So for example, we can say, okay, well, if the average precipitation over the course of 20 years is X, we can model how much we need to reduce during average precipitation years. We also can do drought scenarios, rainy scenarios if we have a wet year. We also need to look at population increases and decreases, how much demand is going to be needed for future generations and how do we accommodate for that. Once we've done the modeling and we have our baseline data, we can kind of establish some targets. We have the predictive models based on data. We can establish reduction goals or targets for various industries based on what we can do with stakeholders to reduce usage in order to allow the aquifer to replenish back to normal, usable, sustainable levels. So the next actions needed, strategies to achieve vision. So once we determine how much reduce, we need to adjust how much reduction we can have. So reducing drawdowns, we can take a look at this. How can we use less water? For example, on public water systems, we can use less through different campaigns, different advertising campaigns that public water systems and governments can use to the general public, such as voluntary reductions, just asking people not to water their lawns or not to wash their cars as often or take shorter showers. You can have a scalable fee for usage where you increase fees for more use to help reduce overuse or excessive use. Incentives, grants could be offered to maybe xeriscape properties, cut back on green grass that requires a whole lot of water to maintain. And essentially, some of these areas are high plains deserts that really shouldn't have Kentucky bluegrass. Long watering restrictions is another one. You're only allowed to water an hour a day every other day. We can also do incentives for low flow fixtures, things like that. There's a lot more things like that. There was an advertising campaign in Denver a few years ago, and it was fairly successful, and successful to the point where they had so much less water use that they had to raise their fees because of the fact that they weren't being able to meet their costs. The other thing is agriculture. Agriculture is going to be a big use of water. Obviously, farming crops, things like that, animal feeding operations, and agriculture-related industries that are just going to use a lot of water. A crop, one of the incentives that we can type to do for reductions is basically adjust water use for the crops based on weather. What's the natural weather? How much water do they really need? Incentives for equipment upgrades. Instead of flood irrigating fields, we can use pivots. The pivots these days are pretty specific. They can be targeted for very specific amounts of water that the crops will use and not overflood and overflow the fields. For less efficient systems that we have farmers create return ponds. One of the reasons the aquifer doesn't replenish quite as fast as it used to is because of the fact that a lot of these little collection ponds have been filled in and turned into farm fields, and the groundwater is no longer, those ponds aren't collecting water and then allowing that water down into the aquifer. Again, adjusted fees for usage, overusage by farmers, that can be implemented. Produce incentives through either the Farm Bill or different programs that allow to grow crops that take less water, or to not grow crops at all. And then alternative watering schedules, perhaps just have the farmers reduce water loss due to evaporation by having them water at night. Industry and business reductions, again, programs to reduce business, industry, and government. Have local governments begin xeriscaping and transforming some of the green areas into less water-intensive areas. Scheduling of watering at public and corporate areas. We've all seen the sprinklers running in the middle of the day during a rainstorm. If we could stop doing that to allow that areas to water themselves, or just schedule at night. Introduce drought-resistant vegetation. Incentives to minimize water use. If again, rebates on bills, and again, fees for overusage. And eventually, if you had to, you can put in water restrictions. The other thing to do would be, if you can water or use wastewater recycling instead of regular fresh water that's pumped, we can use water that's already been used once and use that to help reduce the amount of fresh water we're pumping out of the ground. So once we're done drawing down, reducing, we're going to need to monitor and adjust. We're going to have to continually monitor what the aquifer levels are, the natural systems such as storms, rains, how much precipitation we're getting, the reductions by stakeholders, other stakeholders such as residents, drinking water, residential areas, businesses. And that basically allow for continuous adjustment to the models and the plan targets that we've established based on this base data. And again, looking at weather modeling, well monitoring, resident reductions, industry reductions, all that stuff will allow us to continually monitor and update the models. Weather modeling would basically be, if we're due to have a wet year, we can kind of adjust the models to say, okay, what are the forecast holds and how can we adjust the systems. Establishing the needed goals. So again, we need the data. We've talked about that. Involvement in order to get all this is going to be the stakeholders. Again, a wide variety of stakeholders is going to be needed. And one of the ways that this program will be set up is to do a regional approach with a supervisory committee, because of these plan covers essentially 8 different states within this region where the aquifer sits. A nonprofit organization that can kind of work across state boundaries and outside of governmental restrictions will kind of oversee the overall plan. And then within each region or each state, if you will, project teams will be established for each state to help establish regional goals and to work with regional stakeholders, again, within regional and state laws that allow to accommodate, reduces any conflict that might be the differences between Kansas water law and Colorado water law, and different state management agencies. Colorado can work in Kansas, etc. So I believe that having an overall group that oversees these regional groups that are based on state usage and state reductions, we can take a look at that in it also allows for regional groups to act locally in the sense that their Kansas regional group is working with Kansas groups and Kansas stakeholders and Kansas organizations to form this, essentially a committee or whatever that will oversee the Kansas part of the operation. And then all of those regional committees would then report to the overall monitoring organization. The other thing is that because this covers such a wide area of territory, the South Dakota weather patterns and usage is probably going to be a lot different than obviously Texas. And that regional approach will allow for the differences in the weather patterns and the recharge rates that may be occurring. It also going to change, population of South Dakota is much less than Dallas area, or even Colorado or New Mexico. And that would allow for a much more specific targets within those areas that are going to make the most difference. So that's the strategies. Again, working with these stakeholders, getting all the stakeholders involved, establishing the goals by analyzing data. Actions, again, the reductions is really what we need to do and stop using faster than we can in order to allow the aquifer to recharge. References for this presentation are here. If you have any questions, thank you very much for listening.